It's now my great honour to introduce the Honourable Doug Cameron. Doug Cameron is a former trade unionist and Senator for New South Wales for the Australian Labor Party. In the Rudd government, he was Parliamentary Secretary for Housing and Homelessness. Prior to that, he was Shadow Minister for Housing and Homelessness. He was the Chair of the Environment and Communications Committee, and I think most people in this room will know Doug and will know that throughout his whole life, he's shown the kind of bravery that Polly was talking about before. Throughout Doug's career, to say he was a stalwart standing up against so many of the neoliberal policies that have caused so many of these harms would be an understatement. Doug has dedicated his career and his life to speaking up for people and getting people to work together. And I don't think he'd mind me telling you that he is now actually a climate refugee living in Tasmania. Would you please join me in welcoming Doug Cameron?
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everyone. I'm afraid after almost 60 years of doing this, I can't go without a drink. Could I firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and thank Auntie Violet for her welcome to country. And I would like to thank Richard and the Australia Institute for the invitation to address the Climate Integrity Summit. I recently read an article by Minouche Shafik, former president of Columbia University and the London School of Economics, and a member of the House of Lords. The article is entitled "World Order in a Time of Monsters," and leads with a quote attributed to the Italian Marxist philosopher and politician Antonio Gramsci. And the quote is, "The world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." Isn't that so true when you see what's happening in the US and elsewhere? Like Minouche, I found this quote to be of particular relevance given the seismic shift in what has been regarded as the international order. Minouche also raises the need for a new social contract. And a key component in developing a new social contract will be to solve what the World Energy Council describes as the energy trilemma. That is, to balance three competing aims: energy security, environmental sustainability, and energy equity, which is about affordability and accessibility. Some scholars have identified that a focus on low-cost energy by the World Energy Council will mean the continued use and development of fossil fuels and, in essence, the retention of the status quo of the energy sector. Fossil fuels remain cheap energy sources because they have never paid for the externalities such as long-term storage of their waste products, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide pollution, nor has the energy sector paid for the environmental damage already incurred despite making massive profits. It's important to consider the climate and energy debate in Australia in the context of how do we build a good society? How do we create jobs while meeting the global warming challenge? This will become increasingly difficult given the re-election of that disgusting individual, Donald Trump. I really can't stand all these politicians pandering around to this guy now. It's disgusting. I would recommend that everyone read the recent speech by Bernie Sanders, and where he outlines the emergence in America of an authoritarian I knew I would stuff this up, an authoritarian kleptocracy underpinned by a super-rich oligarchy. While we do not have such an overt attack on democracy in Australia, the conga line of coalition politicians and business leaders using Trump's election to reinvigorate opposition to environmental and energy policies will inevitably place even more power in the hands of the fossil fuel industry. While many here argue more needs to be done, and I agree with that, the election of a Dutton government would mean a return to climate denialism and leave Australia relying on carbon dioxide emitting fuels well into the future. The lack of environmental care or understanding in the coalition will ensure increased regulatory capture of government by the fossil fuel industries and a quick capitulation to the Murdoch empire. I think 3 of the last mineral resources ministers out of the last 5 have all gone to work for the fossil fuel industry. I mean, regulatory capture is something we don't hear enough about in this country. So there'll be more attacks on environmentalists, there'll be more attacks on the Australia Institute, more attacks on unions and individuals who seek to intervene on behalf of the environment and the working class. Leaders must be capable of clearly articulating the devastating implications of global warming and of the courage to stand against power, privilege, and vested interests. As the recent US election demonstrates, it will be insufficient to rely on personal attacks on Dutton as he embarks on a fear campaign focused on electricity costs, refugees, minorities, and the propagation of unscientific nonsense. I personally would rather have Anthony Albanese, Chris Bowe, and Tanya Plibersek addressing climate change and global warming than Peter Dutton, Ted O'Brien, and Jonathan Dunham. It may not be the best outcome we've got at the moment, but it is better than what we will go to if we lose this next election. I was fortunate to serve as chair of the Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee for 3 years, from late 2010 to mid-2013. During that period, the committee received briefings from eminent Australian climate scientists on the effect and implications of human-induced CO2 in the atmosphere. It was a privilege to be briefed by the late Professor Will Steffen, who has been widely acknowledged as a giant of environmental science. Professor Penny Sackett, former government chief scientist, told politicians in 2009, act on climate or kill future generations. I don't need to outline the implications of failing to address climate change to this audience, as they are well known, and we witness the destructive reality of global warming on a daily basis. I have said on many occasions that a fundamental problem in Australia is short-termism. Seeking to defend jobs that result in irreversible global warming is short-termism at its worst. I understand the importance of carbon-producing jobs for many in Australia and worldwide. Both I and my family depended on the coal industry for our livelihood for well over a decade. I was a maintenance fitter and union delegate at Liddell Power Station for over 7 years, and the local union organiser for coal industry maintenance workers for a further 5 years. And I must say, this is many decades ago when I was at Liddell. It was a heap of shit then. It's a bigger heap of shit now. And all those coal-fired power stations are heading the same way. So there must be a move away from coal-fired power. Thousands of families have enjoyed a good life, economic employment and security as a result of the mining industry and unions ensuring well-paid jobs. The coal and power industries are the bedrock of economic activity, jobs and family life in Muswellbrook, Singleton, surrounding districts and communities around the country. It's not unreasonable for those families to be concerned about their future economic security. It's also not unreasonable, but essential, to take steps to reduce CO2 emissions and environmental destruction. We cannot ignore the indisputable scientific evidence of the short and long-term implications as increased CO2 in the atmosphere drives environmental destruction. Now, the Murdoch press continues to seek out and publish commentary by respected former union leader and former Labour MP Jenny George, and has used her comments as the basis to attack action on climate change. I have great respect for Jenny and the leadership she has shown for working Australians. However, on this issue, she is wrong, misguided, and fails to understand the science, the economic, environmental, and social implications of global warming. When smart, articulate, and experienced individuals like Jenny cannot embrace the move to renewable energy, it demonstrates that so much more needs to be done to communicate, educate, and organise within the community. I understand why Jenny is concerned for the implications of increasing energy prices on working class Australians. Jenny has fought for working class Australians her whole life. However, arguing that we are losing our competitive advantage in cheap energy while ignoring CO2-induced death and destruction is inconsistent with her remarkable lifelong contribution to improving the lot of working class Australians. It will be working class Australians, the poor, the disadvantaged, and future generations who will pay the price of this cheap energy quest. The Australian trade union movement has always understood that low wages and cheap labour comes at a significant cost to living standards. Just as cheap energy based on fossil fuel will impose devastating costs for future generations. Everyone wants to make energy as cheap as possible. This can only be done to the extent that cheap energy is environmentally sustainable and does not cause irreversible damage to the planet. Having legislated targets is important, even though Jenny argues it's not. Jenny points to the difference between devising the lowest cost path to achieve these important targets as distinct from devising a system that provides the cheapest energy to consumers. This is where Jenny's arguments collide with science, common sense, environmental sustainability, and the urgent need to reduce CO2 pollution. A system was devised centuries ago to provide the cheapest form of labour to the British imperial system. It was called slavery. And that resulted in death, subjugation, and horrendous inhumane exploitation. That system of cheap labour was exported around the world and resulted in a civil war in America and blackbirding in Australia. Not many in the modern world would argue to reintroduce slavery or blackbirding because it is cheap. Similarly, those who understand the implications of cheap power based on fossil fuels reject this as a solution to increased electricity costs. Jenny asserts taxpayer-funded relief packages and relying on temporary band-aid subsidies and one-off budget-opaque funding is not a solution to the ever-increasing cost of power. The reality is governments will need to intervene to assist those who, due to economic circumstances, find it difficult to pay for heating and cooling as we transition to renewable energy. Jenny's arguments about a Plan B are eerily consistent with the arguments from fossil fuel industries, the coalition, and supporters of nuclear energy. Jenny asserts we are stuck in the past. I find this quite bizarre, when Jenny's Plan B will leave us relying on power plants well beyond their use-by date and increasingly subject to shutdowns caused by aging, unreliable plant and equipment. Small-scale nuclear reactors cannot and will not be available in time to replace a decaying, unreliable power industry based on coal. And I want to turn to building a good society. You'll need to tell me if I go too long. How do we navigate the energy transition while ensuring energy justice and a just transition? Academics and scholars, along with politicians, are addressing the justice and equity implications of the clean energy transition. How do we deal with the adverse effects of the energy transition for specific communities and groups on the front line of the transition? In a 2020 paper by Sanya Carley and David M. Kaninsky, entitled Justice and Equity Implications of the Clean Energy Transition, they traverse many of the issues that governments and society need to address. Distributional justice, procedural justice, reconciling inequalities, restorative justice. These are issues that governments will have to deal with over the next few years. While there's ample evidence that clean energy industries provide more jobs than fossil fuel industries, many of the jobs will not provide the same salary and conditions that an industry that has not been required to pay for externalities can afford to pay. I believe that a returned Labour government must pay even more attention to ensure workers displaced from fossil fuel industries have a voice and support during a transition. It's no use going up there and telling them they're all bad people, because that only creates more problems. There are overseas examples such as Germany who have managed the transition in an effective, humane and considered manner. Jenny George seems to equate government intervention and support as a negative. I, to the contrary, see this as an essential part of bringing working class communities to the table and ensuring fair and equitable treatment of affected workers and communities. A national transitional forum building on the Net Zero Authority. I hadn't really heard about this Net Zero Authority. It's one of the most low-key things ever, but it is so important. It is absolutely essential, and it needs to do work. It's important that a voice for affected workers are heard. I argue this, that in conjunction with the Net Zero Economy Authority, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet should establish and fund a process of education, consultation and financial support in regional communities currently reliant on fossil fuel industries. 2, the fossil fuel industry, along with the federal, state, local government and community reps, should begin a program of identifying opportunities for industry diversification at the local and regional level. 3, a program to identify the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities in fossil fuel-reliant communities should be undertaken at the local level with reports to federal cabinet and national cabinet. Funding for TAFE in affected areas should be significantly increased to ensure the capacity for retraining in emerging industries that promote diversification of employment opportunities. 5, the fossil fuel industry and government must develop specific programs for the environmental rehabilitation of coal mines and coal-fired power stations. 6, a program of income security for workers displaced from existing fossil fuel-related employment should be established with a combination of redundancy payments and wage subsidies if displaced workers lose income by moving to lower-paid alternative employment. 7, a wage subsidy funded by the fossil fuel industry and government equivalent to an average of a worker's past previous 2 years' earnings should be paid and be in place for at least 5 years to give workers some economic security. 8, subsidies to industry and business moving to fossil fuel-reliant communities engaging in transition should be established along with support for relocation, land purchase, buildings and equipment. 9, A programme of encouraging state and public service instrumentalities and departments relocating to transitioning communities should be established. 10. Public servants should be supported by relocation allowances and specific help to buy homes payments. 11. Support for community facilities, hospitals and medical practices should be established if existing facilities are inadequate to meet the community's needs. 12. Financial and logistical support should be provided to modular housing companies prepared to relocate to communities and regions in transition from fossil fuel industries. 13. Given the urgent need to reduce costs in the housing industry, establishing a network of modular housing companies in transitioning communities would help not only the communities but give the nation access to more affordable homes in this housing crisis. 14. Modular housing companies should be supported to purchase and use the most efficient technology, including robots and artificial intelligence. 15. The federal government should establish a national housing commission with a mandate to build well-designed, environmentally sustainable modular housing capable of reducing the cost of heating and cooling through a combination of modern design and materials. 16. Communities in transition from fossil fuel reliance should become the engine room for building highly productive, fit-for-purpose homes for low-income and social security recipients incapable of entering the housing market. And the last point I want to make is that regulatory capture should be addressed, and no minister for minerals should be allowed to go back and work in the minerals sector that they are supposed to be dealing with. The nation must stop pretending that transitioning from a reliance on fossil fuels to renewable energy can come with no cost to the government, industry, taxpayers, and the community. Surely, ensuring the future of the planet, building a good society, and meeting the challenge of human-induced global warming is fundamental to ensure future generations can enjoy nature and a life free from the devastating floods, bushfires, and natural disasters. We must bring the community with us, ensuring working-class Australians are not brainwashed by snake oil salesmen, racist, anti-scientific politicians, and billionaires who seek only self-advancement at the expense of the nation. Let's ensure we meet the challenge of global warming and ensure a national priority of just transition for everyone. Now should not be the time of monsters or those who seek to argue that we should be free to make profit at the expense of the nation. I'll just finish on this. When Joe Stiglitz was here, he spoke about his book, and he quoted Isaiah Berlin, who said, "Freedom for the wolves cannot mean death of the lambs." And that's what's happening now, because working class people will bear the brunt of not dealing with climate change effectively. And we must do that. We must do it now, and we must do it decisively. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and a very special thank you to all our supporters who help keep us running. We're not funded by political parties or fossil fuel companies or government, but by people like you who know the importance of evidence-based research in shaping the critical decisions facing Australia. If you'd like to support us to continue exposing inconvenient truths, challenging vested interests, and explaining the big issues in plain English, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au to find out more.